Jill held her breath until her lungs burned and her hands shook by her side. She closed her eyes and pressed the back of her head against the icy brick wall to try to hold out a little longer. She opened her eyes, seeing black spots against the colorless sky, threatening another heavy snowfall from the thick clouds. That sentence probably has too many adjectives in it. If you do an adjective on every noun, then it has an odd rhythm to it, but I'm going to leave it. Jill gave up and heaved out her breath in swirls of vapor around her head. Blood throbbed inside her head, and she blinked, drawing in frigid air. Through the white clouds of her breath, she saw the corpses turn their entire bodies to aim their stiff necks and heads in her direction by the wall. She exhaled another blast of steamy breath before the first had completely dissipated. More bodies that meandered through the snow-covered yards and street stopped with snow up to their battered shins. They slid their milky eyes in her direction. I need to watch that particular verb. I think milky eyes is a good description for like zombies that just have like the cataract over eyes. But I tend to use it a lot, so it's probably best to only use it once per story, maybe a couple times if you're talking a novel, but it loses its power if it's overused, and I think that's sometimes a word that I might lean on a little too heavy when describing zombies' eyes. She doubted most of them could see well through their cataract eyes, but they sensed her breath and trudged through the snow toward her from a dozen directions. Jill looked back to the sky and sighed out another cloud. During the summer, being quiet was enough. Now I can't even breathe without calling down trouble. They opened their jaws and showed broken teeth as she looked for a path through them. They raised hands showing bone through broken skin on fingers. Their shoulders drew closer together as they covered the distance. Jill thought, if this plague had never happened, I'd have started high school last fall. We would probably be out of school today. I'm going to make that a contraction. I also have a habit of not always using contractions, which are kind of important in dialogue and in even thoughts, especially for a younger character like this, because that's, of course, how people normally talk and think. We'd probably be out of school today after yesterday's blizzard be sledding as snowplows tried to catch up. You all would be driving to work with chains on your cars and leaving me alone. I'm going to put tires there. That's a better word. Essentially, it means the same thing. You took everything from me, and now I'm just cold. The bodies approaching her listened in silence except for the crunch of their sneakers, wet socks, or bare feet. Jill lifted her knees high to take bigger steps out over the drift. With the bitter air and the resistance of the snow, her breath came in quick bursts. Each time they adjusted their trajectory and clawed at her. She ran close enough to them that she had to duck their reach to pass under their grasp. One of them caught and lifted her stocking cap away from her head, pulling a long strand of her hair. The sharp cold struck her and robbed her of warmth down through her body with the shock. She glanced back and saw a dead man in a rotten t-shirt and swim trunks chewing on her toboggan, with his yellow eyes rolled up in his skull. "Is it the taste or the warmth?" she whispered. Jill whipped around and pumped her legs without getting her answer. She felt her hair sliding back and forth on the smooth material of her coat. She imagined the next errant grab might be a handful of hair, and they would have her. I should have cut it a long time ago, she thought. Alright, that's 2 words in that case. My mother liked it long, Jill huffed for the hungry dead to hear. They grabbed her by her hair, and now she is gone. I'm still here. Stop talking to yourself and keep running, Jill. As they whipped around to chase, she heard their joints crackle and saw their skin tear from the stress of the pivot. Through the new rips, she saw thick ice crystals coating over and through the frozen muscles. She remembered hoping that winter might freeze them and allow her to roam free in the cold. She snorted and laughed out one harsh note at the thought. Bodies farther up the street in both directions turned around and honed in on her last breath. I'm going to think honed in should be hyphenated. I'm not positive, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Alright. Honed in on her last breath. Their dead flesh was only a shade or two different from the snow cover. No vapor escaped from their open mouths. She heard the sharp crack of teeth sound behind her. Jill shivered from the cold and the sound. She thought, I actually miss hearing them moan. They were easier to avoid before they went silent. I can't wait for your lungs to thaw. They clicked their teeth at her in response. Jill left the snow-covered street. That should be hyphenated because it's a compound adjective. Snow-covered street and charged up the hill. She rounded behind the house and tried to put distance between her and the dead. You were too stupid to follow my tracks, but you moth right to my body heat. I need more cold air between me and you. At the fourth house over, she ran into the chain-link fence with her gloved hands in front of her. The fence rattled shrill through the still air, shedding snow and ice off the top. Jill took a deep breath and hauled herself over the fence. The wire loops bit into her hands through the insulation of the gloves. A sharp end caught the side of her thick coat and tore it open to the cotton insulation. She stumbled to her knees in the backyard of the house, splattering cold wet between her boots and their ski pants. I'll put a comma there, and there's one up here. Shedding snow. I'm going to separate those clauses with commas. Alright. She regained her feet and slushed forward until the hand snagged her heel. Jill screamed and heard it echo back as she jerked her foot free. She looked back and saw... Okay, I'm using back too much. She looked down. I don't even know if that's right, considering she's probably on the ground, but we'll see. She looked down and saw the snow tumble off as the body lurched upward. She saw the face locked... Okay, she didn't have to see it. It could just happen. The face locked in a scream with an actual icicle hanging from one upper tooth. The nose pressed back into the skeletal face, and the eyes remained still and empty. She couldn't tell if they were frozen in the sockets or if the corpse had nothing else he cared to look upon. Jill turned and saw the snow billowing up from 3 other snowy graves in the fenced yard. She spotted one hand opening into a claw with a crack. 2 fingers snapped loose and fell back into the snow. Don't have to use back there. Back is one of my downfalls as a writer. I keep writing it. Jill wasn't sure they could still bite, but she wasn't up for testing them. She ran across the yard and hit the next fence at full bore. She flipped over and landed on her butt in the snow. Jill gritted her teeth, feeling a harder layer of ice than she expected. The creatures impacted the chain link behind her with 4 separate crashes, pouring snow off on her hair and shoulders. She wasn't sure if it fell from the fence or their bodies. She brushed the wet off her scalp and burning ears as she staggered up and forward. I need a new hat. Jill weaved by mounds of white over swing sets, collapsed sheds, and an above-ground swimming pool. She fought the temptation to reach over and break the ice on the water in the pool. The guy in the swimming trunks eating my hat may have come from here. His girlfriends could still be under there in a bikini. I'm surprised the sides haven't burst yet. They must have used really good materials. She became hyper aware of bumps in the snow, expecting each one to lunge out at her with frozen hands and broken fingers. Jill rounded the curve of the street behind the house and found a yard with a dry fountain tilted at a sharp angle near wooden railroad ties. The tie marked off lifeless beds. Let's say ties again. The ties marked off lifeless flower beds. She felt her throat grow hot and scratchy looking on the outlines of familiar things. Jill swallowed and flexed her numb fingers in her gloves as she turned to face the back of the house. The wood along the back splintered where the paint had been stripped and pressure washed, but the primer for the repaint had never been applied. An overhang above the sliding glass door buckled and warped under the downfall from the previous night. Icicles hung clear and dangerous through the cracks in the stressed sheet metal. The concrete of the patio underneath was the only clear ground she had seen all day. I promised never to come back here. Jill approached the back of the house. I'm out of options. She stepped under the bulging metal and looked up at the sharp ice aiming at her head. The broken metal creaked and popped. She stomped her feet out of old habit to knock the accumulated snow loose from the tread of her boots. Jill pulled the door at the latch, but it held locked. The weathered back of the house popped against its frame with her force. One of the icicles dropped loose and sliced another opening into the cotton of her coat behind her shoulder before she realized it had fallen. The ice shattered against the dry concrete behind her boot, and she yelled. Her voice echoed, and the metal above her groaned. Jill heard none of the moans she had grown used to hearing during the warm months of the plague. I don't need to put hearing there again. She just grew used to them. But she heard snow crunching under exposed feet. She could not explain why, but a bare, bloodless foot in snow had a different sound than a boot. The creatures approached around both sides of the house through the small pines behind the yards. The steps came slow but steady. She looked in both directions. She felt sure they had left one of the windows or doors unlocked, but she couldn't afford to run through the middle of the monsters, checking each one. She stepped to the edge of the concrete and ran her gloved hand through the snow along the side. Her fingers bent back painfully on something solid, and she cursed. Jill used both hands to sweep snow away from a red concrete hat, until a red concrete hat exposed itself through the white. She grabbed it, wrenching the hat from side to side until the body broke loose from the ground. She hauled the lawn gnome up out of the snow with a grunt. Jill gritted her teeth and spun in an unbalanced circle before she released it. The gnome punched through the glass sideways near the lock. Cracks laced up from the oblong hole at the edges but did not shatter. Jill frowned and approached the sliding door with her hand out to undo the lock. The glass fell in a wash from the frame and cascaded across the linoleum floor inside like water. Jill drew back her hand but stepped through the crunching glass under her feet. The gnome wobbled on the floor near the stove. She heard sharp cracks behind her and turned around. The body, stepping onto the concrete, only wore shredded jeans. The brown flesh opened in wide sores and held the bone tightly from head to toe. Most of the dead man's hair was missing along with the scalp, showing discolored skull bone. With each step, its right shoulder popped in and out of joint with exaggerated snaps forward and back. Never enough time. She looked from side to side in the kitchen for something blunt to open the exposed skull. She remembered a knife block on the counter, but the counter was bare except for the elephant cookie jar. She thought about whether the hollow ceramic elephant would get through the monster's brain before it shattered in her hands. Did we take the knives with us? I don't remember. The snap and pop of the shoulder drew closer. The shriveled cadaver stepped a bare foot on the remainder of the icicle, crunching it under its heel. Jill stepped back until she bumped in the refrigerator, knocking off the magnets. Her report card and her brother's letter offering a diving scholarship floated to the floor. "Run, stupid girl," Jill whispered, seeing her breath in the darkness of her family's kitchen. "I'm cold and tired." Snow fell from the bare skull from above as he popped toward the shattered door. Crystals packed around the base of his sunken eyes, but the man did not blink, nor did he look away from Jill at the refrigerator. The sheet metal folded down and smacked him in the bony forehead, staggering the decrepit body. The mass of snow and ice avalanched down on top of him, covering the concrete and making him seem to vanish from sight. Jill smiled as she looked to see if he would pull himself off his face from the blanket of snow. Before he did, the overhang snapped from its bolts and folded down over the door with a loud clap, plunging her into darkness. Jill jolted and covered her mouth. She dropped her hands and looked back and forth in the dark kitchen. Will that actually hold? She heard hands crack and bang against the other side of the misshapen metal. The brakes opened back, showing light and clawing hands on the other side. The metal shook, but stayed over the shattered door. Jill turned and walked out of the kitchen up the hall. She saw motion through the other windows in the rooms on both sides, but did not stop to watch. Jill passed her brother's room and her parents' room without turning her head. She walked into her own room at the end of the hall and cleared her throat. She shivered and sniffed, realizing the inside was just as cold as the outside without the wind. Jill shook her head and began digging through her things. She scattered figurines off the top of her dresser and flung clothes off her bed onto the floor. She approached her closet and gripped the handle. Jill took 2 deep breaths and prepped to pull the door open on a hungry corpse. She paused and got down on her hands and knees on the carpet. Jill took another deep breath and blew the vapor out under the edge of the door. She waited, hearing the hands pounding metal from the other side of the house, but nothing from her closet. She stood and pulled the door open. Jill yanked out her neon yellow backpack. She unzipped the main pocket and dumped out notebooks and packs of paper. The covers had pen drawings of angels with feathered wings and hearts with knives through them. She stared at her drawings from her 8th grade school year. 8th grade would need to be hyphenated, I think, because we're talking about the school year, her 8th grade school year. She never got to finish. You have to stab them through the head, not the heart, stupid girl. Jill raked her hand through the pack, dumping piles of photographs out of the backpack. She opened the other pockets and shook out mechanical pencil, highlighter markers, loose rubber bands, paper clips, and more. She ran her fingers through the clutter on the floor and uncovered the pads in bright green plastic. She shoved them back into the pack. I'll need more. Why are hygiene products harder to find than food? She paused over the pictures and flipped a few over on the carpet. Jill squinted. Why did I have all these in my backpack? Was I making another collage? She flipped them back over and read messages scrawled on the back that told her to stay alive, don't get bitten, and we'll make it together. Jill shook her head and blinked. She remembered being in the middle school as an emergency shelter when things had gotten bad very quickly. The adults were scared and confused. The kids had phones and watched videos uploaded from around the world. They had seen movies and knew what was going on. The adults were still whispering about Ebola and rabies. It was the day school pictures were distributed. Kids cut them out, wrote messages, and passed them around. They swore to look out for each other as they sat along the wall waiting for further instructions. Why did I forget this? Jill remembered that some parents arrived pounding on the locked doors to the office. The campus safety officer had refused to let anyone inside. Some of the kids ran past and opened the doors. One of the men tried to take the gun, and the officer had opened fire. The dead came to the pounding. All right, let's separate this out. To the pounding, the gunshots, and the open doors. Jill had run. All right, let me make that another paragraph. Let's probably find how it was, but I'll split it up. Jill had run. She did not even remember who left with her or how she got home, but she was alone when she arrived at the house. It was warm that day, and she could hear the moans and groans of the ones that had followed her. She ran her fingers over the photographs on the cold bedroom floor, considering whether to take them with her. She stood up straight. If I want to see dead people, I'll just walk outside. Jill ran her hands through her closet, screeching the hangers. I'm using that sentence structure a lot. That may be something that needs to be fixed at some point. She pulled clothes off the wires and crammed them into her bag. She ran her hand over the top shelf, knocking down board games, cards, and tokens Cards and tokens rained down on the closet floor. She knelt by her bed and swept her gloved hand through the dust underneath. She paused as she touched the side of the guitar case. She licked her chapped lips. Instead of pulling the case out, she stood and walked to her dresser, holding the open backpack. Put a comma. Jill jerked open the drawers. They resisted as the wood stuck from seasons of heat and cold, but she pulled them free. She shoved a couple thicker pairs of socks and fresh underwear into the pack. She held up mittens with no finger separations in them. Jill considered them, but decided to drop them back in the drawer. She pawned through each drawer twice, looking for another stocking cap, but she didn't find one. I know I had one. Jill stepped back to the doorway and paused. She turned and scanned the room in the harsh light off the snow outside her window. She eyed the posters and snorted. I don't remember who this girl is. All these actors are probably dead and walking around. Their lungs are too frozen to growl. Jill tilted her head. Maybe it is warmer. Okay, let's make that a contraction. Jill tilted her head. Maybe it's warmer where they are. A shadow crossed her wall from the window that faced the street from her bedroom. She backed into the hallway and listened. The pounding and scraping still came from the kitchen. None of them were in at her window yet. They are following the sound of the monsters banging on the metal until they sense my body heat in here. Jill turned. Maybe there's a stocking cap in my brother's room. She stopped in the hall and turned her back on her brother's door. I bet my father had one. Her throat became thick and she rubbed the back of her gloves against the wet heat building around her eyes. She tried to push the thought out, but all she could ever see of her father was the last moment. Her brother had pulled her backward out of the passenger side of the back seat of the car. Her father had crawled out from behind the exploding airbag. He put himself in the seat between her and the creatures tearing through the driver's side of the car. He screamed and held his leg above a broken bone that stuck out. You don't want to say leg again. Stuck out of his thigh. And the material of his pants. Jill had fought, but let me split that again. Make another paragraph. Got a lot of paragraphs starting with Jill, but that's okay. Jill had fought, but her brother still pulled her out of the car from behind. Her father grabbed the seat on both sides and held on as the dead chewed on his back. They pushed him, but he would not let them through as her brother pulled Jill backward down the alley, away from the wrecked car and their screaming father. Jill could not rewind her memory to anything earlier about her father without getting stuck on him holding the monsters away from her with his body. She hated that fact, except that it spared her from remembering the details of the dead tans tearing her mother's beautiful hair off her head before she could get into the car. I have to find a hat. Jill realized she was staring at the picture on the wall next to her parents' door. The reflection of the glass was bright, but she could see herself at age 2 and her brother Jack, a few years older, sitting on a hill with an old-fashioned wooden pail sitting between them. Say set between them. I'm going to take that comma out. An old-fashioned wooden pail set between them. My parents think they're so funny. Get to the contraction again. Thought. My parents thought they were so funny, naming their kids Jack and Jill, probably just for this picture. A crash sounded from the kitchen that never seemed to finish. Jill cursed. I need to get food from the pantry. Why am I just standing here? Jill ran toward the sound in the kitchen. She stopped where the carpet met the linoleum under a row of brass strip and tacks. The slim corpse with the bald spot that went all the way to the bone staggered through the torn metal and the collapsed frame, other crackling bodies shoved through behind him. Jill looked at the pantry door across the kitchen and back at the crumbling body covered in frost. She caught the sharp edge of a shard of glass he caught the sharp edge of a shard of glass under his bare foot and punched it clean through the top. She saw solid black sludge suspended inside the open wound around the protruding glass. You are going to stink when you thaw out. Glass shattered behind Jill. She turned and saw a wall of bodies slicing themselves as they forced their way through the picture window in the den. Jill zipped the backpack and charged to her room. She heard them bounding back and forth between the walls in the narrow hall. Pictures lifted off their hooks and fell to the floor to be stomped by frozen feet. She slammed her door without looking and pressed the lock button. Jill shook her head. That will hold them off for 0 seconds. She went to her window and looked outside. A scattering of corpses crossed the yard and street diagonally toward the far corner of her house. Be fast, stupid girl. Thank God we live in a one-story house. We lived in a one-story house. She turned the lock on her window with a pop. A few bodies turned from side to side, but none of them focused in on her yet. She pulled up, sliding the window with a sharp crack. One corpse actually spun around twice, trying to locate the sound echoing through the neighborhood. Jill dropped the backpack behind the brown hedges first. She swung her leg out and sat on the windowsill. This is the first time I ever snuck out of the house. I was a good girl. I am a good girl. Jill heard the door bounce in its frame as the dead reached her bedroom. She looked back in at the posters. Will you brave men hold them off while I escape? Jill remembered her father holding the seats and feeding them his back. She coughed and slid out of the window, landing behind the hedges. She reached up to close the window, but could not stretch far enough to pull it closed. Alright, let me say down because we already said closed. I read stuff like that and I wonder if I ever edited it before. She heard the door splinter in her room and dropped down to her knees. Jill pulled her arms through the straps of the pack. The thick coat made it a bit of a struggle. Socks, underwear, and a few maxi pads. This was not worth it. She stared through the hedges at the street. She had excellent cover. Jill exhaled and saw all the bodies in the yard turn to face the bushes. I used to love winter. She shoved through the hedges, scattering brown leaves on the snow. She ran between them, ducking her head and trying to hold her hair. I should have gotten a headband or even one of the rubber bands I dumped out of the backpack. Stupid, stupid girl. Jill crunched over the street and stumbled on the next curb, falling to her knees in the drift. She struggled up as the creatures closed in around her. She saw the icy hands poking out of the snow, palms up, and she jumped away. Jill saw the can of beans clutched in the left hand. The right hand held a revolver in a tight grip. The trigger finger of the right hand had broken off below the second knuckle, leaving a sliver of bone jutting out. They've started setting traps with bait. She dropped down and pulled at the can, but watched the gun. The label tore away as she pulled the can free from the hard hand. Both hands bobbed with the force, but then stilled. She watched, but neither hand moved again, and the snow didn't break. You were still one of us, just trying to escape with your dinner, I guess. Did you run out of bullets or run out of time? If you'd left the gun, you could have carried 2 cans. A dull shadow crossed over her from above, and she bolted. Jill ran between the houses with the unmarked can in her grasp. She entered the trees behind the neighborhood and weaved between the trunks. She saw shadows stumbling through to her left and right, but she kept running. Jill saw the banks of the creek with an icy layer in the middle. She picked up her pace and leapt across. Jill spilled onto her stomach on the opposite side. The can rolled loose from her grip. She dug it. Let's not say back, because I do that too much. Let's just take that out. She dug it out of the snow and took a moment to put it on one side, to put it in one of the side pockets of her old school backpack. I'm not going to use the comma there. Jill shouldered the bag and continued her run through the trees. She heard loud cracks behind her from bodies crashing through the ice in the shallow creek. She emerged from the narrow strip of forest out on the main road. A few businesses lined the opposite side of the road in strip malls and office parks. Roofs had collapsed in a few spots, and the ice and lack from the ice and lack of maintenance. Jill scanned the street to try to gain her bearings. She felt like she was looking through a filter that washed out the color and sharp edges in the world. Everything looked familiar, but not as she remembered from warmer days uncovered. She whispered, "I miss Jack. I wish Jack were here. They would just be twice as attracted to our combined body heat. When will winter be over?" She saw them crossing in the open near the gas station, with shattered windows and snowdrifts billowed back into the store, blocking the shelves. Jill shook her head, still not believing it could be true even after seeing it all winter. The naked woman passed between the building as the fatter men lumbered after them. Their bare butts and pot bellies jiggled as they ran. Jill looked them up and down for frostbite, but their feet pumped in and out of the snow too quickly for her to tell. The Polar Bear Club? How can they stand it? As the last man crossed behind the station, Jill whispered, "Shrinkage." The women emerged from the other side of the building wearing nothing except for duffel bags. The bags hung heavy from their shoulders as their breasts bounced from side to side with their motion. You'd think they'd at least wear a sports bra. The dead staggered along the road as the Polar Bear Club jogged by them unnoticed. I guess it works. Her breath swirled around her head, and the dead bodies in the street turned toward Jill. The naked men ran out from behind the gas station. They heaved for air, sending clouds of steam in the air, but the dead continued to hone in on Jill like she were the only warm body in the area. She shook her head, still not worth running naked in the snow. Jill ran across the highway and down the slope behind the strip mall. She hooked around onto the access road. She darted her eyes back and forth between the trees and the slope leading up to the larger interstate. Jill didn't realize how compact the space was until she traversed it in the cold silence of the snowfall. Her footsteps seemed too loud in her ears. Jill crossed behind the fire station and an elementary school. The stone walls still stood, but most of the rest of the structures were gone and buried below snowfall. She could still see the black and scorch marks from the fires. She stopped shy of the utility shed in the narrow field behind the high-tension power lines. Alright. Jill shielded her eyes and looked up at the ice hanging down like spears. She imagined them snapping and crushing the shed. Jill pictured the ice falling through her like deadly rain. I'll need to move soon. She waited a moment longer but saw no movement. She crossed the field and pulled the snow back from the door and slid through the opening. Jill closed the door and allowed her eyes to adjust to the light coming from the vents high around the walls. Alright, I used Jill the previous sentence, so we are just going to use she. She dropped her backpack off her shoulders on the floor. She shook her head. I'm tired of being cold. Alright, I don't think I need to have that tag in there. I can just move this up. I'm tired of being cold. Her voice rang back at her. Jill decided to risk it. She took a few books down from a shelf without looking at the covers. Jill tore out pages and placed them on the broad grill sitting on top of a generator casing. Jill felt around the shelves and found a cardboard box. Only a few matches still rattled inside. She tried to strike them off the side, but the cardboard folded and the sandpaper had worn away. Jill struck it off the vent of the generator and dropped it on the pages in the grill. She searched for a can of lighter fluid but found none. Jill sighed and tore more pages out onto the fire. She picked up a chair in the corner and slammed it against the frozen It slammed it against the floor a dozen times until the wooden legs broke loose. Jill tossed them in the grill and fed more pages on top. She took her gloves off and shoved them into her pockets of her coat. Jill turned her hands over above the flames. Her eyes rolled up in her head. She thought about lowering her hands into the grill to cook them and actually felt tempted. Jill stepped away and knelt by her pack. She pulled the can out of the pocket and retrieved a can opener from the shelf. She couldn't figure out which was the top without the label. She locked the can opener on one end and turned the handle until she heard a boom at the door. More cracks and scratches sounded around the walls. Jill set the can down without looking. Set the can down. It doesn't matter if she looked. What am I doing here? Alright, let's fix that. She set the can down with the opener still attached. She watched the door pitch in its frame. If the creatures turned the knob and pulled, she would be trapped. She climbed up the shelf and leaned out to peer through the vent. The dead lined the walls around the shed 3 rows deep and were emerging from the woods. Jill jumped down. She stared at the door and watched the knob shake. I'm already trapped. Something popped and hissed behind her. Jill spun, expecting to see them folding back one of the walls. She looked back and forth in the empty shed. I'm losing my mind. She saw fluid spray into the air. Jill spotted the can of beans sitting in the fire of the grill. She cursed and ran forward. Jill grabbed the can and screamed. She dropped it and it bounced off the floor. She clutched her wrist and saw blisters form on her fingers as she watched. The can exploded and blasted lima beans up one wall all the way to the ceiling. Jill screamed and backed away. She sighed. I didn't like lima beans anyway. Did I really set the can down on the fire? Jill pulled her gloves back out and pulled her gloves. Jill pulled her gloves on and groaned as she irritated the burns on one of her hands. Alright, let's make it a she here. So many Jills to start the paragraphs. This would be something I would need to fix on a second pass, I think. She lifted the grill by the handles and carried it to the door. She set it down and took 2 breaths. She turned the knob and pushed, but the press of bodies outside kept the door closed. I'm going to die in here. She turned the knob and threw her shoulder into the door. She shook and her face turned red with the effort. Come on, help me feed myself to you, monsters. Jill broke the door open to pale daylight. She continued to push until gray fingers closed around the open edge and began to pull. She reached back and lifted the grill. As the door opened, Jill threw the grill out to the side. Flames blasted up from the front of 2 of the dead. Blasted up over the front of 2 of the dead. Let's make that undead. That'd be a little clearer. One ignited and staggered backwards. The others turned to face him. A few grabbed hold and even bit down on the burning flesh, igniting themselves. Jill charged and pushed through the crowd in the field. More piled onto the fire, but others turned and followed Jill below the power lines. She ran and jumped over a wire fence. More emerged from the trees on both sides. She approached the road, but saw more of the monsters following the roadway in a herd. Jill turned to look for another way to go. She glanced down and saw long brown singe marks over her coat. Jill swallowed and bowed her head. Jill, come on, the voice echoed up from below. She turned and looked toward the road. She saw him pulling a sled loaded with boxes ahead of the dead following along the road. She waved him off. Jack, no, just go. I'll be fine. Shut up and come on, girl. Jill groaned and ran toward her brother. She grabbed the rope to the sled beside him, and they pulled it down the road ahead of the pursuers. Jack's legs were longer and slimmer, and Jill had to work hard to keep pace with him. They left the road and made their way through a park she did not recognize. Jack stopped them at a set of stairs leading down to a cellar door below the snow under a building. Jill reached down to lift a box, but Jack grabbed her shoulder. Hold up, Jill. Let's get out of sight while they're still too far to find us. She looked up from the supplies. You just want to leave all this stuff out here? Jack looked back and forth. It's not like the rotten snowmen are going to eat it. Let's go. Jill followed him downstairs. Her boots slipped out from under her on the icy stairs. Okay, let's make this a she. She grabbed the railing and twisted around. Jack held under her arm and helped her the rest of the way down. He pushed her through to the cellar of the park office and closed the door behind them. Jack slid a board into the hooks over the door. She suspected he'd added himself. Jill sat down on the floor against a metal support pillar in the storage area. She crossed her arms and shivered. I'm tired of being cold, Jack. He lifted a blanket off the cot. Looks like you tried to catch yourself on fire. I had to use a grill to distract them, she said. I burned one of my hands. He wrapped the blanket around her and pulled her up from the floor. You'll lose heat on the floor. Sit on a cot. Sit on the cot. She let her brother lead her to the cot, and they sat down beside each other. Jill looked around. I thought we had a no basement rule. People got trapped hiding in basements. We saw it happen, Jack. Jack shrugged. There are 3 ways in and out of here. It's also a few degrees warmer down here. I think it masks my body heat a little. Speaking of rules, you started a fire. Jill turned away. I should go. 2 of us in the same place will attract them worse. We're just putting each other in danger until it warms up. We saw it happen, right? We'll be okay for a while, Jack said. It's not like when there were 5 of us. Maybe we should rethink this plan, though, Jill. I don't like you being out there alone. You burned yourself, and I can't protect you if we are separated. Jill wiggled her toes and felt wetness in her socks as the numbness left her feet. She frowned. I left the socks in the backpack at the shed. I can't do anything right. I'll get him killed just like when Mom and Dad tried to keep us alive instead of taking care of themselves. I'm going to capitalize Mom and Dad here because they're being used in place of names. She said, I'm taking care of myself just fine. I can't do that if you're drawing them to us like a big tall furnace. Jack shook his head. If you're taking care of yourself just fine, why did you go back to the house? We had a rule. Jill cut her eyes at her brother. How would you know that unless you went back to the house too? Or are you following me? Jack smiled and looked away. A little of both, I guess. The place is a mess now. Jill bowed her head and blinked. It's not like we were ever moving back in, Jack. What did you go back for? He put his hand on his shoulder? Probably makes more sense if he put his hand on her shoulder. I'm no good at finding food. I lost my hat, Jill said. Jack took his stocking cap off and pulled it down on her head. He started tucking in her hair underneath the knitting. Jill pushed his hands away and finished tucking her hair herself. Jack put his hands together between his knees and rubbed his palms together. Alright, I don't need to use together twice. Jack put his hands between his knees and rubbed his palms together. You have to keep your hair covered. You saw what happened to Mom. Jill let go of the cap and pulled the blanket tight around her. I was with Dad, getting in on the other side of the car. I missed most of it, thank God. Between you and Dad, I'm not sure my feet touched the ground most of that day. Jack sighed out a cloud of vapor. I can't stop seeing it. It was awful. I had her hands and they had her hair. I tried to pull her away, but she let go and pushed me. I was a couple inches taller than her, and she shoved me like a linebacker. I slammed into the side of the car backward. That's when I looked, Jill said. Jack cleared his throat. Any memory I try to pull up of her starts with her hair being pulled out. I hate it. I'm the same with Dad. I'm the same way with Dad, Jill said. Jack nodded. Yeah, I missed most of that. I had blood in my eyes after the crash. Between the two of us, we have quite a tragic set of memories. I used to look at pictures of them at the house sometimes. I didn't take any of them, but I kept going back for some reason. Jill sniffed. I'm sorry I messed that up for you. Jack put his arm around her shoulder and squeezed. It's just a house. The part that still matters is right here. Mom and Dad would agree. Jill felt warmth from his arm through the blanket and coat. I need to go. Being here isn't safe. I'll make better choices, Jack, I promise. Jack held her and pulled her back down on the cot. Wait. Why don't we stick together, Jill? We could keep moving. We can move south until the cold isn't a factor and winter passes. We considered it before. This has to be a better plan. Has to be a better plan. This has to be a better plan with what we've seen. I would feel better about our odds if we found a way to stick together. I would feel better about our odds if you didn't have to look out for me. Maybe I will go south and you can take care of yourself. Jill shook her head. If we run up the snowy hill together, you'll fall and break your crown, and I'll come tumbling after. Jack leaned back and dropped his arms. She felt cold with the absence. He said, Mom and Dad. Mom and Dad thought they were so clever, didn't they? Thought. Jill said, I need to go. Being here is a bad idea. We're going to get hurt. Jack allowed her to stand up. Jill, take the blanket and some of the supplies. You can have the sled. I'll find something else and help you find a new place. She dropped the blanket back on the cot. I'll be fine. Fists beat on the outside of one of the doors on the far side of the cellar. Jill clenched her fists inside her gloves. This is my fault. Don't be stupid, Jill. That's just our cue. Come on. I am stupid, and it will get us both killed. Jack lifted the bar away from the door they had entered and opened it. He led her out and helped her up the frozen steps. They looked over the edge across the snow and saw a wave of bodies filtering through the trees toward the building from all across the park. We shouldn't have been here together, Jack. Jack patted her on top of the cap he gave her. I got this, girl. Take what you want from the sled and find shelter. Remember, more than one exit and no fires. I'll check in on you in a few days. What do you mean you got this? Jack winked and stepped out into the snow. She reached for him, but he was gone. Steam rose off his scalp from the missing cap. He lifted a lighter and flicked it as he ran. He dodged past the shed and the dead followed him. The park cleared as the corpses weaved back into the trees. Jill sighed. One of the monsters rounded the corner and grabbed the cap off Jill's head. She stepped away and slipped. Jill yelled as she tumbled down to the bottom. The creature took a step and tumbled down after her. Jill pushed through the door and slammed it closed. She set the bar and limped to the center of the room, holding her back. The fist pounded on two doors. She started crying. I'm tired of being cold. I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of being alive. She went to Jack's shelf and took down a can of lighter fluid. The can crinkled as she sprayed the top of a table. She dropped the can and searched the shelves for matches. She found another lighter instead. She flicked it open and locked it. Jill dropped it on the table and watched it go up. She pulled off her gloves to warm her hands and saw the fingers of the gloves had caught. She tossed them into the fire and cried more. Jill held her hands out and felt pain in the blisters. She gritted her teeth. I will be warm at least. After several minutes, the bars splintered on the door behind her. The door burst open and all the dead that fell down the stairs stumbled into the cellar. She did not turn but heard them regain their feet and crackle as they approached her and the fire. I'll let them have my hair and my warmth, and I'll be with my parents again. She stared into the fire as the frigid hands closed on the shoulder of her coat. One finger slid past the collar and brushed her neck. Jill pulled away and knocked over the table. A few of the bodies fell into the flames as she pulled away from the cold hand. Jill ran for the third door and cast aside the bar. She barged out into the cold and held the rails to get back up to ground level. As she ran through the snow between bodies without her gloves and without her brother's cap, she cried. He is going to be pissed when he gets back and finds out I burned down his shelter. Stupid, stupid girl. Jill topped the next hill and saw the dead approaching from every direction. Time to tumble down. She dropped to her knees and clawed at the snow on the hill. Her hands burned with cold and the blisters split in her palms. I'll have frostbite by morning. Jill laid down on her back and pulled the snow over her. She packed the snow around her face, leaving her mouth and eyes covered. She burrowed her arms down under the blanket of ice and waited. The gray-skinned woman in a sundress stepped out beside her and turned from side to side. Jill held her breath. Something down the hill caught the woman's attention, and she went back the way she came. Another creature passed from the other direction and walked out of sight. 3 more walked over her. One big man stepped on the edge of her arm, and Jill showed her teeth, but he stepped off and kept walking. Jill held her breath until her lungs burned. She breathed out a puff of steam and sucked in cold air again. One of the corpses paused over the top of her in the dissipating vapor and turned in a circle. She held her breath until the creature walked away. Others followed, passing Jill in the snow. Others followed. Let's do a comma here. Passing Jill in the snow on both sides, all going down the hill. She lost feeling in her hands and feet, but she waited. Another walked over her and knelt down in the snow. Well, it was a good idea while it worked. Jill closed her eyes. The hands lifted her out of the snow. Jill, burning down the house and burying yourself in the snow was not the plan. She sighed and her teeth chattered. I'm sorry, Jack. He pulled her to her feet, and she opened her eyes, seeing the smoke rising into the sky. They're all going for the fire now, Jill. I'm thinking the answer is more heat instead of less. You may have figured it out. She shivered. I'm a genius. Jack put his arm around her and led her through a break in the distracted corpses. We're staying together, girl. I can't do this alone anymore. Okay, she said. I'll carry your weight for a while, I guess. Jack said, Did you lose your hat again? Did you lose the hat again? She brushed the snow out of her hair with her throbbing hands. Don't start. All right. So that is Cold Dead Hands by Jay Wilburn. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can see more stories all through the month of November and December. If you are curious, you can join me through November and watch me write on a novel each day until I reach 50,000 words. Thank you all for watching, and I look forward to talking to you again.